Our theme then for these last 6 weeks, it comes from this little book called Bible Stories for Grown-Ups, Reading Scripture with New Eyes by Josh Scott. You don't need to buy it. I'm sure he would appreciate it if you did, but it's totally up to you. So that's where. So the idea here, and we'll do some kind of a little bit of an overview of the concept, and then each week we're just like, I know Pastor Karen, my spouse did this deep dive into the stages of faith, and I know that had such great resonance with the group. And then Pastor Caitlin walked you through these amazing images of God, and I'm like, nah, we're just going to do a simple Bible study here. So thanks for dumbing it down with me over these next 6 weeks. And so what we'll be looking at are 6 different stories that may be familiar to you, maybe not. If they are familiar, that's great. If they're not, that's great. But we'll be making sure to identify what we'll talk about here in a moment is our grown-up lens as we engage these different stories. And so that's one of the ideas behind the book that I found really helpful and a good way to engage that. And I think it's on your handout too. So 4 components of a grown-up lens. And this isn't to be derogatory against those who are not grown-ups. It's simply an encouragement for us, kind of as we develop in our lives, as we mature, as we know that we can encounter information differently, that we make sure that our faith grows with us. I think that's one of the things that we've been very slow to realize in our faith formation as congregations. Like, we're super intentional in equipping children and their families from birth up through the day that their kids are confirmed. I would hold in our Lutheran tradition, any of our curriculum, any of our Bible study, any of our teaching, it's second to none. I mean, it's what we're known for. The issue is that at that key point in a teenager's life, when their brains are developing so much, and their worlds are expanding and changing, that's also the point where we formally say, well, you're kind of on your own. You can come to youth group if you'd like. And what we find so often is that since that's the last point where there's kind of this built-in formal structure for young people, age 15. So think about when you were age 15. I shudder to remember when I was age 15. But remember what your worldview was like, what you thought of the world, or how the world worked. But then these 15-year-olds, it turns out, you may have firsthand experience with this too, they keep growing and learning. Their worlds get bigger. They understand things in new and complex ways because our brains develop and we're able to hold different thoughts and we ask bigger questions. But if we've left faith, so that's why so often the faith gets left there at age 15, kind of like, it's good, I felt good about it, I really like it, but then the world has expanded and moved on, and so then it becomes, well, that was one of those things I did when I was a kid. I played baseball and I went to church. But, I kind of outgrew it because I couldn't hit a curveball when I got older, and, that was a good thing for a kid, but, I learned a lot of other stuff in a lot of other ways, and it gets disconnected. So this is just a way for us to be intentional about saying we have a grown-up lens here, too, so it keeps developing. It maybe aligns with some of the stages of faith things you were learning about a couple months ago. So the 4 components. Curiosity, that's super important. That we can be curious. And then our curiosity keeps developing and we keep asking better questions. That when we have a response to a question, what it should do then is prompt even better questions. A second part is to take the Bible seriously, but not always literally. And so we'll even get to a couple examples of what that means today. So taking the Bible seriously, but not always literally. In many ways, we undermine the point of the Bible if we try to take it literally. So biblical literalism is actually a very new creation. It was essentially unheard of in the Christian tradition until the 1800s. So anyone who pounds their Bible and says, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it, that's actually a very new innovation in the life of the church. Third is to pay attention to a story's historical and biblical context. So all of these stories that we're going to hear came out of were told in certain times and certain places. And so it's important to know a little bit about what those times and places were, because worldviews change and shift. And then also to know what the biblical context is. So not only was it in a historical context, in a certain point in time, but then it's also woven into this biblical narrative. So we have at least some inkling of, well, what part of this greater story is this smaller storytelling? And then applying the Bible's meaning to our own contexts, which is to say, what does this word have to say to us today? What word does this have to say to me today? And I think it's kind of important to say today, because tomorrow it may say something different. And I think that's part of the power of the inspiration of the Word of God. And so understanding and reading the Bible is important to do on its terms, not on our terms. One of the things that it's important for us to know is that the Bible is not interested in answering all of our questions. We've got good questions. I affirm our questions. The Bible may not have an answer to the question we're bringing to it. And then also just to remember that no single story will capture it all. There's a discussion question that hopefully in your groups you'll talk about today about the story we're engaging. And so from Paul in 1 Corinthians 13:11, perhaps a guiding verse for these weeks, Paul wrote this: "When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, reason like a child, think like a child, but now that I have become a man, I've put an end to childish things." So it's not to say that there's nothing valuable about being a child, but we also know we grow and develop, and there are things that we grow out of because we have a new station in life. So today we will talk about the flood. And the story of Noah. You didn't have it in advance, so there is no expectation that you read this. If you had read this, I don't know how you would have, because this wasn't publicized anywhere. So if you had just read the flood story, amazing work. Each week I will then put what the next week's story is, so I would recommend that for next Wednesday you read. Oh, now you're looking ahead. Spoiler alert. All right, I'm gonna give you less to work with then. So if you've been around these sessions, you know I like my comics, and it's amazing. Like every time I'm preparing these, yesterday there was a Noah's Flood comic. The Flying McCoys, so this is Noah trying to sell the ark after the flood, and the guy saying, okay, it looks like it's in pretty good shape and not heavily used. Oh, one last thing, how come it smells like animals? And then it says, Noah nearly closed the deal. I mean, that's a good question. What happened to the ark after the flood? You know, the Bible actually doesn't care to answer that, so that's why we get joy. But this is a story that there's an awareness of, kind of a cultural awareness. You don't have to be Christian or even Jewish to have an understanding of, or a knowledge of this story. It's permeated our larger culture. People understand the story of Noah and the flood. One of the reasons it may resonate is that flooding is a pretty common theme. Have any of you ever lived through a flood? Yeah, some of you? Anyone want to live through a flood again? No, it's terrible. When Karen and I were on our pastoral internships, we were at churches in Breckenridge, Minnesota, and Wapaton, North Dakota, so right on the Red River Valley, and that was one of the now many seasons when the Red River was flooding. So I remember that we volunteered to go help and pack sandbags to help buttress the water so it wouldn't come, because they built the hospital in Breckenridge, or I don't remember which town the hospital was in, but they built a hospital just kind of near the river because it's nice, you know, it's a healing, but then it's a problem when the river floods and then floods the hospital. So we were filling sandbags to keep it out of there. When we lived in Ames, Iowa, our side of town flooded and we couldn't get anywhere for 3 or 4 days because the water, it took that long for the water to go back in the upper Iowa River to recede. And so our basement, you know, wound up with water all over. I mean, so if you've been there, you know it's not a good feel. And it's not new to us either. It's one of the most ancient concerns. It's an ancient theme. The Epic of Gilgamesh. I don't know if anyone's been sitting around reading that one lately. From the 21st century BCE, so this is, 4,200 centuries old. It may be the oldest written literature in the world, and it includes a flood story. And I'm just going to share a summary of that story because I think it gives helpful background that will inform some of the ways that we can then hear the flood story that's in the Bible. So here's the summary of the flood part of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The gods are angry with humans because the humans are too noisy. The unceasing clamor was too much, so the gods devise a plan to destroy human life through a great deluge. They all agreed to keep the plan a secret, but Ea, the god of wisdom, found a loophole. He went to the home of the hero Utnapishtim, which was made of reeds. So Utnapishtim's home was made of reeds, and Ea spoke the secret to the reeds. Utnapishtim heard the news, of course, and followed Ea's wisdom. He tore down his home and repurposed the materials to build a boat on which he and his family and the seed of every creature that lives upon the earth could escape when the flood came. The waters rose so high that even the gods became frightened by what they had unleashed on the earth. The storm lasted 6 days, and on the 7th the waters receded, and eventually the boat came to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim released a dove, then a swallow, but both returned when they couldn't find a resting place. Finally, he released a raven, which did not return, giving the indication that it was safe to leave the confines of the boat. Utnapishtim offered a sacrifice to the gods, who happened to show up and grant both him and his wife immortality. The story ends with a rainbow in the sky and a pledge to never again send the flood waters to destroy the earth. So that's the Epic of Gilgamesh, written long before the story of Noah's flood was written. So one of the things that's up on the screen that's important for us to note, Josh Scott writes this: the Bible was not written in a vacuum. It was written in a context that contained many voices telling many stories that were trying to make sense of the world and the people's place in it. So my hunch is, as you heard that little excerpt or that summary of the Epic of Gilgamesh, there were some connections that one said, hey, that sounded pretty familiar about some other flood story I've heard. And it turns out the other flood story you've heard is probably a millennium newer than that one, at least. So that's just the background. So this is a common story. We still have this story today, so the people back in that day and age would have known it as well. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to share two examples of the flood story that we're probably more familiar with in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And as I read each one of them, I just invite you to keep these 4 questions in mind. So by what name is God called in each story? How many pairs of animals bore the ark? How long does the flood last, and what kind of bird is sent out? And then we'll see what we think. So example A, here's a flood story. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. Then the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the air also, male and female, to keep their kind alive on the face of the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground. And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. And Noah with his sons and wife and his sons' wives went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. After 7 days, the waters of the flood came on the earth. The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and the Lord shut him in. The flood continued 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters swelled and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. The waters swelled above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. Everything on dry land, in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, human beings and animals and creeping things and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those that were with him in the ark. At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made. Then he sent out the dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set its foot, and it returned to him in the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took it and brought it into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent out the dove from the ark, and the dove came back to him in the evening, and there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent out the dove, and it did not return to him any more. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked and saw that the face of the ground was drying. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. All right, so in this example, what's God called in the story? The Lord. All right, you got that? How many pairs of animals board the ark? 7 of the clean and the birds. And how about the unclean? Yeah, just a pair of each. So 7 pairs of clean animals, 7 pairs of birds, and 1 pair of all the unclean animals. How long does the flood last? 40 days, 40 nights. And what kind of bird does Noah send out? All right, great listeners. All right, so here's example B. Here's a flood story. These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, and all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and put the door of the ark on its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind shall come to you to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came on the earth. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah as God had commanded Noah. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. On the very same day, Noah with his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons entered the ark. They and every kind of wild animal of every kind, and all domestic animals of every kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every bird of every kind, every bird, every winged creature. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, domestic animals, wild animals, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth. Getting rid of bugs? I'm not mad at that. And all human beings. That's my editorial thing. That's not in the story. And the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the domestic animals that were with him on the ark, and God made the wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens were restrained, and the waters gradually receded from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains appeared, and he sent out the raven. And it went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. In the 601st year, in the 1st month, on the 1st day of the month, the waters were dried up from the earth. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. Then God said to Noah, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives and every animal and every creeping thing and every bird and everything that moves on the earth, and they all went out of the ark by families. All right, by what name is God called in this story? God. How many pairs of animals board the ark? Two, so 2 by 2. How long does the flood last in this story? 150 days. And what kind of bird is sent out in this one? A raven. So interesting. Which one of these is in the Bible? Both. You're right. It's a trick question. They're both in the Bible, which is wild because we have at least those last 3 questions do not align with one another. So anyone who gets all worked up and expends a lot of energy trying to say that somehow, you know, we try to say that everything in the Bible, we try to explain, like, and the word gets thrown out, inerrant. Then what you have to do is start redefining what the word inerrant means, because very obviously we have different things. So we have one flood story that says it was 40 days, that says 150 days. That's an irreconcilable difference. And it doesn't really matter. Because if it mattered, then those that edited these 2 very distinct stories together, they weren't dumb. They realized it was saying 2 different things, but they were weaving these stories together into a sort of tapestry that they thought, or they figured said something more. And so what this is getting at is what, nearly every reputable Old Testament scholar holds is the 4-source theory of the Torah. So the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Are you familiar with the 4-source theory? I won't go deep into it. It's basically there are 4 main sources that get edited together to create Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And these were a bunch of German scholars that did all this digging. So it's the letters that they get called are J, E, D, and P. J for Yahvist. They're German, remember? So Yah, so it's a J, but it's a Y for us. E, the Elohist. D is the Deuteronomist, and P are the priestly writers. And so in this example, the key to know that it was the Yahwist tradition that was writing is that God is called the Lord, and that's the Yahweh. That's what gets translated as the Lord. And so the stories that have that's the hallmark. And this probably comes from around like the 8th century BC. And then the other strand, so that was example A that I read. Example B would be from the priestly tradition, probably around the 5th or 6th century BCE. And so it's a different tradition written, clearly a different time by different people, and then edited together later on. So those oral traditions, when they get passed down and then eventually written down and then edited together, because as you read through the story, you'll come upon that, especially if we sit and read carefully the flood story, all these details are in there. This is just separating out what the scholars believe are the one tradition versus the other, but we see those inconsistencies. And actually, if you read with a kid, they get it right away because they'll ask those questions. Wait, it just said it was 7 pairs. Now it says it's 1 pair. Well, which is right? Yes, because it does say both, and that's okay because we don't have to flatten all those. And so it's okay because that's actually not what the story of the flood is trying to do. And so that's maybe what our conversation can be today, is to try to figure out what might the story of the flood be trying to do? What questions is it trying to answer? And what do those answers have to say to us today? So, where does the flood come from? Why does the flood come? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, you remember, the gods were upset because the humans were too noisy. So they wanted it to, it reminds me of this is a dumb example, but it's the very beginning of Michael Jackson's Black or White video. This is so old. The George Wendt character banging on his son Macaulay Culkin's door, turn that racket off! That's what it reminds me of. All right, go to YouTube and find that. I'm making a great parallel, and I want you to appreciate it in its fullness. So just do that for me. But that was the reason for the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Humans were noisy, and the gods didn't want to put in their earplugs, so they told so they're like, we're just going to wipe you out. The book of Genesis, however, ties the story of the flood to human violence. A very different reason for the flood. Genesis 6:5 says, the Lord saw that humanity had become thoroughly evil on the earth, and that every idea their minds thought up was always completely evil. Genesis 6:11, in God's sight, the earth had become corrupt and filled with violence. And so it's interesting then that there were so there's this familiar, we heard in the Epic of Gilgamesh a lot of details and themes. I mean, the boat rests on the mountain after the waters recede in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The boat rests on the Mount of Ararat in that priestly telling of the flood story of Noah in the Bible. And so that's an interesting thing, but maybe one of the things they were doing is taking this familiar text and repurposing it with a twist so that those hearers who are familiar with it, they would pay attention because, that's not how the story goes. I mean, our ear catches it when the detail of something familiar gets changed, and then maybe that's where the meaning is. And so it's not that the people were noisy, it's that the people were violent. And so then that helps us zoom out to see in some ways, the larger story. So just some verses here, and I'll share some of these verses. So the first is just about creation, and from Genesis 1:6 through 8. So this is another example. Genesis 1:1 through chapter 2, verse 4a, is a very orderly account of creation, to say that there's this God of order, this transcendent God that's an orderly creation. We get that. Starting at Genesis chapter 2, verse 4b, there's another account of creation written in another tradition at another time and place to talk about the relationship, the immanent God who is in the garden with the first humans. The order of creation completely different in those two stories because they're not trying to tell the science of how creation happened. They're trying to tell the story of who this God is who created, and how does this God care for and relate to creation. Those are important questions. So the Bible's not trying to do science, it's trying to actually to do theology. And so Genesis 1, this is that orderly account of creation. 1:6 through 8, God said, let there be a dome in the middle of the waters to separate the waters from each other. God made the dome and separated the waters under the dome from the waters above the dome. And it happened that way. God named the dome sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. Now we know that's not how water works and how the sky works, and it's not that the sky, the clouds were somehow separating or restraining the rain or the water from falling down on us. But we don't slag on the people back then because, again, we have to understand that was their worldview. Plus, we don't have too much of a leg to stand on. There are still people around us who believe the earth is flat. So let's... have you ever seen online, there's the flat earther conventions, and they talk about the worldwide, there are flat earthers all around the world. So anyway, Genesis 7, then this is kind of that undoing of creation, the 600th year of Noah's life in the second month on the 17th day. On that day, the springs of the deep of the sea erupted, and the windows of the sky opened, it rained upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So there's this undoing of creation in Genesis 7. So there's this kind of this parallel between what was going on in Genesis 1 and then Genesis 7 is the undoing of it, because then the sky is there in the worldview, it's taken away and it's undone because, I think one of the important things to keep in mind in this flood story is that actions have consequences. Actions have consequences. And so that's what we see. One of the consequences of the actions of human violence here is they're telling the story, trying to make sense of the world, because that's what they're trying to do. That's what theology is, try to make sense of the world and this God, is that there's this undoing of creation. And so then to get at the idea of the sin and violence, one of the questions that we could ask is, when does the word sin first show up in the Bible? And a lot of folks would just assume that the word sin is in the story when the first humans eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil after being tempted to do so. But the word is not there in that story. The word sin does not appear in that story. The word sin doesn't show up until Genesis 4. And so Genesis 4, verse 6 starts, the Lord said to Cain, so Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve's kids, why are you angry? Why do you look so resentful? Because the Lord had accepted Abel's sacrifices and not Cain's, and so Cain was torqued about that. Why do you look so resentful? If you do the right thing, won't you be accepted? But if you don't do the right thing, sin will be waiting at the door ready to strike. It will entice you. You must rule over it. So that's the first time the word sin appears in the Bible, Genesis 4, verse 7. And what's interesting is that sin is singular here. It's not sins, it's sin, so more as a concept. Maybe that's important. Maybe that's important. Because in Genesis 4, verse 8, Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out into the field. Doesn't that sound like a loaded invitation? This is the point of the movie where they say, don't go back to the house. When they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. So there you go. And then verse 4:15, we have God banishing Cain, and then Cain just saying, well, word's going to get out that I'm kind of a crumb bum who killed his brother. Which, of course, if you're reading the Bible literally, you're like, who does he care about other people? Adam and Eve, they had Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel. Who's he got to worry about? The Bible's not trying to explain that. The assumption here is there's other people. The Lord said to him, so Cain's worried that he's going to get offed because people hear about him. The Lord said to him, it won't happen. Anyone who kills Cain will be paid back 7 times. They'll be avenged 7-fold. The Lord put a sign on Cain so that no one who found him would assault him, which is interesting. So this is actually a sign of grace and protection that God offers to Cain. Actions have consequences. Cain had to, he suffered as a result of him killing his brother. There were consequences. His life was dramatically changed as a result, and God still offered a sign of grace and protection, this sign of Cain. But what's interesting then is in the aftermath of this, in the subsequent generations, there's an escalation of retaliatory violence that we hear the story later on in Genesis 4 of Cain's great-great-great-grandson Lamech. And in Genesis 4, 23 and 24, it says this, Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to my voice, wives of Lamech, pay attention to my words. I killed a man for wounding me, a boy for striking me. So Cain will be paid back 7 times and Lamech 77 times. So there's this escalation of violence that is coming through these generations. And so we've got this undoing of creation. We have this story of human violence that's going on. And so we have then this disorder and disintegration of creation. So things were orderly, things were integrated together, and then there's this rupture that violence is causing. And so that's why we read in Genesis 7:21 about every creature taking its last breath. Now, here's an interesting thing. Kids hear this story and think, well, okay, I get that, but what about all the things that live in the water? And all the fish and everything that's, amphibious. It seems like a field day for them. The story's not trying to tell that. That's not the point of the story. That's all right. And even with that, the actions have consequences, and there's still, at the end of the story, a sign of grace and protection. Genesis 9:11 through 13. God says, I will set up my covenant. Covenant, churchy word, means promise. My covenant with you so that never again will all life be cut off by floodwaters. There will never again be a flood to destroy all the earth. Interesting, that also echoes the Epic of Gilgamesh. God said, this is a symbol of the covenant that I am drawing up between me and you and every living thing with you on behalf of future generations. I have placed my bow in the clouds. It will be the symbol of the covenant between me and the earth. So even in the aftermath, actions have consequences. So it's true with Cain. There's a sign of grace. Same with the flood. There's a sign of grace. So just an interesting thing. So you don't have to get to Jesus in the New Testament. Too often we think, well, grace, like Jesus invented grace. Jesus is amazing. All right, I'm not going to undersell Jesus. Grace did not first come on earth. Forgiveness did not first come on earth when Jesus walked the earth. There's grace and forgiveness all throughout the Old Testament. So then it's all about meaning. Just a couple thoughts as we dig into this to then hear what might this be saying to us today. So it's understanding what it was saying in its original context, both historically and then biblically, and then to help understand what might this be saying to us today. So first of all, it's not a kid-friendly story. I mean, there's so many. I just went downstairs and looked, and like every little kid Bible, it's because it's animals, and it's cute to think about them walking on the boat and whatever else. But it's a horrifying story. Craig Kester, one of my favorite biblical scholars, said the Bible is adult strength literature. And it is. And that's one of the things I love about it, because the Bible doesn't sand off the harsh edges of life and reality. It speaks into the difficulties, the struggles, the sufferings, and the big questions of life, rather than trying to, just to ease around them. But we have to remember this flood story, it's an extinction event that's being talked about, and that human violence is the driving factor in the story. So then a couple thoughts that Josh Scott has about this. So he writes that the story reflects our spiritual ancestors wrestling with their own understanding of God, humanity, and the world. So kind of what's the problem in the world? What are the outcomes of that? And then how does God respond and interact with all of it? So that's what we see in this story, this wrestling. Clearly the wrestling kept going on because we have two very similar yet distinct stories that get woven into one as well. So what might that tell us about what a big question this was, and how deeply our spiritual ancestors were wrestling with these thoughts. And so some of the things then that we can see our ancestors doing is shifting away from the petty gods who destroyed everything just due to a noise infraction. So there's a very different witness to this God who isn't bothered by the noise. So it's a very, very different setting. And what we see in this story, we have God grappling with how to deal with human violence. So we could ask, didn't God see this coming? Well, it seems, according to the biblical authors, God didn't, because God grieved this. So God didn't necessarily see this coming. What would that mean? And what this could also show is that this is this sort of wrestling over the centuries and now millennia later, is that there's an ongoing learning and unfolding and progressing of an understanding of who God is and how God interacts with us and with the whole world. And so one of the things then that Scott writes, God is continually inviting us to learn and grow in our understanding of God. Our ancestors learned that God doesn't act out of annoyance. That's the Epic of Gilgamesh gods. Perhaps we're learning that God doesn't respond to our human violence with global violence, but with love and compassion. So then what's interesting maybe for us to think about is what role does human violence have? Maybe we got it licked. I don't know. I haven't checked the news today. Maybe human violence is no longer a problem, so this story has no resonance or could be. But I know in 2021, the combined global spending on military by all the countries of the world was $2 trillion. That's a 2 followed by 12 zeros. So that may tell us the state of human violence. And that's on the macro level. We know things happen on this. I mean, we turn on the news and we can read about what's going on in Ukraine, in Palestine and Israel. We can, there's still maybe it all got licked in the last 15 minutes. I doubt it though. On the macro level, but it's on the micro level too. So we experience that interpersonally and much closer to home as well. And we know violence happens in physical ways, but we can also think about the rhetorical ways that violence is perpetrated, either that we do it or that's perpetrated against us, to remember that our words do have power. So then one of the ideas, just to leave you with, is what might be the arcs we can board? So to take this idea of Noah and the flood, and what's the analogy, what's the metaphor? What can we pull from here? So one possible suggestion is there are some arcs that we could board. The arc of empathy, the arc of compassion, which is really empathy plus action, the arc of peace, the arc of justice, and to be clear, a restorative justice, not a retributive justice. One of the things Scott says is peace in the biblical tradition is not just a cessation of conflict, but the presence of wholeness. It's not just a lack of bombs, but the healing of wounds. The peace we desperately need will not come to us without a commitment to the work of justice. So that's his takeaway from the story of the flood. And now you'll have the chance to go talk with your groups and see what some of your takeaways are. There's a whole bunch of discussion questions there. I hope you've got some good conversation today. Next week, we'll up the stakes. We get the binding of Isaac. You can read Genesis 22, 1 through 19. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next Wednesday.